Welcome, I'm Michael FitzGerald. I'm a journalist with Near FM and I'm also with Near TV, and I'm joined here today by Keith Bolender, who is from Canada. Keith is a journalist, he's an academic, he's a broadcaster. Keith, welcome to DCTV and welcome to Ireland.
Thank you, Michael.
Keith, we're here because you're here to address a conference, and you're also here to talk about your book, Voices from the Other Side, which is subtitled An Oral History of Terrorism Against Cuba. Keith, have you been involved in the subject of Cuba for long? How long have you been, as I say, studying Cuba?
Well, I've been connected with Cuba for over 20 years in a variety of other projects. This specific book is the first I've written on Cuba, and I started it in 2007. Most of the interviews were done in 2008, and it was just based on my interest in oral histories and knew peripherally the background of terrorism against Cuba. And the more I got involved in it, the more I found out the number of people that have been affected by terrorism in Cuba.
Mm-hmm. Do you think many people appreciate or even understand what it was like before the revolution, the Batista regime, which one would argue was your classic despot? The tourism industry, what there was at the time, tended to be very much a mafia phenomenon. What we see now, to a certain degree, you could argue was bland politics, but it seems to me people, the current generation, don't even know about what was there before the revolution and why the revolution happened.
Very much so. The younger generation of Cuba definitely sees that perception because they didn't live through the change. It was their parents' generation that dealt with the revolution and instituted the social justice programs. Now, the perception of the younger generation in Cuba is their economic concerns, their future for jobs. They don't perceive the social justice programs in the same way. So it's an entirely different attitude the younger generation has as opposed to their parents' generation, which went through the revolution. And prior to the revolution, the younger generation really doesn't connect in almost any capacity.
Am I right in my perception that if a Cuban gets in an inflated tire and somehow or other manages to reach the Florida shores, they get automatic asylum, but if a Haitian does the same thing, they probably get towed back out to sea again. One is treated differently to another, even though they come from pretty much the same region.
You're absolutely correct. There are Haitians coming from Haiti that come to Cuba to live a better life in Cuba. What your comment is based on the Cuban Adjustment Act, sure, which is now wet foot, dry foot policy. If a Cuban lands in Cuba and lands in the United States and puts his feet on American soil, he is given special immigration status that no other citizen of the world has. And that is something the Cuban government has always said is an inducement for Cubans to get on rafts and very unsafe modes of transportation to get in, risking their lives to get into Miami. So that is still very much a contentious issue between Cuba and the United States. And it is a situation that no other citizen in the world has, including not only the Haitians, but the Mexicans or anyone from Latin America. If they come into the United States, if they're caught, they're immediately sent back to their country of origin. If a Cuban lands in the United States, puts his feet on American soil, he is given immediate status, unlike any other citizen in the world.
So is that purely based on politics rather than on race?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely part of the American policy against Cuba to disrupt in any capacity the revolutionary government.
Yeah. Now we know from the good old days that America on more than one occasion tried for regime change. Did essentially that put in place a blockade of Cuba. Is that still there, and how effective is it, or how widespread is it in terms of affecting the lives of Cuban citizens and the government itself?
Well, it's not something the Cuban citizens think of on a day-to-day basis because it's almost internalized, because it's been a part of the Cuban life for the last 50 years since the beginning of the revolution. The economic blockade is still in place and in fact was tightened in the 1990s under the Torricelli and the Helms-Burton Act, when the Cubans were dealing with their Great Depression, known as the Special Period, the American government tried to tighten the screws to make things worse economically, following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989. Now, since 2001, the Cuban government has been able to purchase food on an annual basis from approved American government agencies. So that, to me, so there's a circumvention of the embargo. But the other side, which very few people consider, is that the Cubans are still totally eliminated from accessing the American market, which is obvious for obvious reasons. It's so close. So the embargo is still in place. The propaganda is still in place. The extraterritoriality influences of subsidiary American companies not being able to trade with Cuba is still in place. So the policy of the United States against Cuba that originated very shortly after the triumph of the revolution is in the majority still in place. So yeah, it's just that the Cubans don't think of it in that terms on a day-to-day basis because they've been living with it so long.
So is the perception from an American perspective that, in essence, Cuba is a client state? So in other words, it only has quasi-sovereignty, that really it's ours, and any uppityness that came out in 1958 is really, it's not their right to do it. They do it because we allowed them to. Is that being a bit harsh, or is that the reality on the ground?
Well, that's the historical reality of the origins of American hostility against Cuba. American perception and American foreign policy towards Cuba goes back to the early 19th century when the Americans first explored the possibility of owning Cuba. And it's that perception of ownership of Cuba that has maintained itself up to this day. Now, they had ownership of Cuba for 60 years, coming in the War of Independence, ostensibly to help the Cuban rebels gain independence from the Spanish colonizer, and all they did was replace the Spanish with the Americans. So for 60 years, the United States controlled and owned and had everything they wanted from Cuba until Fidel and the revolutionaries came along, and the United States to this day still hasn't forgiven that action. And in context to their policy, the United States has very little interest in reforming or helping to change or move forward the Cuban government. They simply want to destroy the revolution, and their policy has always been aimed that way, and since the Kennedys right up to Obama, that policy has maintained itself.
To a certain degree, you could argue that that client relationship that the United States wanted to have with Cuba, Cuba tended to have with the Soviet Union until about 1990, when the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union collapsed. How significant was the break of that relationship between what is now Russia and Cuba? What impact did it have on the ground in Cuba?
It had tremendous impact. It caused the Great Depression in Cuba. The Soviet Union was,
Is it almost like the economic safety net was pulled away?
They were their prime trading partner. Subsidies. The Soviet Union had tremendous economic influence in Cuba, and reciprocal to the Cuban side. So they were their economic lifeline. When that was taken away in a very short, when that ended in a very short period of time, the Cubans lost up to 40% of their GDP within 2 or 3 years. So, and I was there at the time in the early 90s, 1992 to 1996 was the worst years of the special period, which is how the Cuban government called that time, where their economy simply collapsed. And it was at that time, instead of reaching out to the Cuban side, the American government decided to try and make it tougher for the Cubans to come out of this economic depression. As I mentioned before, the passage of the Torricelli Act and the Helms-Burton Law made it tougher for other companies and other countries to trade with Cuba, with the intent of making things so bad in Cuba economically that the people themselves would overthrow the government.
Now, would I be right in thinking that although the blockade has had significant areas in significant impacts in different areas, In reality, the major impact it would have had would be the blockade of capital. In other words, as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed, you couldn't get the capital to do investments or to even counteract some of the negative economic consequences. How do you feel about that, Keith?
That was a part of it. I mean, Cuba is still prohibited from accessing the world international financial institutions, and the capital investment, the Americans tried to control capital investment into Cuba, but other countries, Spain, Canada, Mexico, did come into Cuba. When the Cubans opened up their side of things as far as making it easier for capital investment to come into Cuba and concurrently opening up the tourist industry. So, you know, the rest of the world did have opportunities, but the Americans were trying to control that as much as they could possibly do. And, you know, a major consideration was the Cubans could not get any credit on any international level, which, you know, is a substantial disadvantage for a third world country to have to face.